Okay, let's dive right into this explainer, because we are about to completely shift how we view the creation of successful businesses. Look, if you've ever thought that building a massive venture required some rare personality trait or just sheer dumb luck, get ready to see things a whole lot differently. Today, we're focusing on process theories of entrepreneurship. We absolutely have to start by dismantling this cultural myth of the lone genius toiling away in a garage. You know the one. The prevailing narrative just loves to lionize the single, heroic visionary who magically disrupts an entire industry overnight. But honestly, the reality is that entrepreneurship is a structured, adaptable, and highly learnable sequence of actions. It's not magic, and it's definitely not an innate genetic gift. Actually, it is a rigorous process.
So, think of this agenda not as a dry syllabus, but as a toolkit. It's going to guide us through the exact evolution of how companies are built, from the corporate drawing board to the chaotic real world. We'll cover 1, the analytical process, 2, experiential learning, 3, navigating ambiguity, and finally 4, the art of making do.
All right, kicking things off with part 1, the analytical process, analyzing internal and external forces. Let's see how this builds from that comfortable traditional view of corporate venture creation.
This brilliantly illustrates the Harvard School theory, which actually dates all the way back to the 1950s. It breaks down venture creation into this dual process of systematic auditing. Step 1 is the internal analysis, basically asking, can we? This is where you audit your startup's proprietary resources and operational capacities. Do you literally have the financial and mechanical tools to pull this off? Then, step 2 is the external analysis, asking, should we? This forces you to zoom out and examine macroeconomic gaps and existential threats. Because let's be real, just because you can build something doesn't mean the market actually needs it.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is finding this strategic fit. The Harvard School theory tells us that if your internal resources do not flawlessly match the external environmental conditions, the venture is pretty much destined to fail. It's exactly like a lock and key. You just cannot force a solution into a market that isn't shaped for it.
Moving on to part 2, experiential learning, moving beyond the book. Now we step out of that analytical planning phase and shift into learning by doing.
This is where book smarts absolutely must transform into practical know-how, because analysis only gets you so far, right? It's really fascinating how Kolb's learning cycle perfectly explains how Pixar transformed explicit technical data into highly proprietary creative know-how to make the world's first computer-animated feature film, Toy Story. See, the Pixar team had immense book knowledge. We're talking PhDs in advanced geometric algorithms, but they totally lacked the tacit creative know-how to direct voice actors or manage a compelling story arc. So what did? They pushed raw prototypes into concrete experience. They held fierce daily critique sessions, that's your reflective observation. They extracted universal rules about pacing, which is abstract conceptualization. And finally, they reanimated the scenes, active experimentation. They cycled through this process out of absolute necessity just to bridge that massive gap between theory and reality.
Building on that, Corbett suggests that as your venture grows, your cognitive style actually has to pivot. Look at Airbnb's founders for a second. In their early evaluation phase, they used a divergent learning style, brainstorming crazy open-ended solutions, like famously putting air mattresses on their apartment floor just to see what would happen. But as the company transitioned to the elaboration phase, their learning style had to aggressively pivot to accommodative. They had to engage in some really gritty, hands-on execution. They literally flew to New York City, knocked on hosts' doors, and manually photographed apartments themselves. They matched their cognitive style to the stage of the company to push it into hypergrowth.
Which brings us directly to the core premise of Steve Blank's Lean Launchpad methodology. Get out of the building. You absolutely cannot discover what a customer truly wants while sitting behind a desk running an internal analysis. No way. You have to treat your business ideas as hypotheses and test them out in reality through intense customer discovery.
Okay, part 3, navigating ambiguity, effectuation, and sensemaking. But what happens when you face extreme market uncertainty, where there is literally zero data to analyze?
What if you're creating a market that doesn't even exist yet? Well, Carl Wake's famous paradox captures the essence of sense-making perfectly. How can I know what I think until I see what I say? In highly ambiguous environments, you cannot analyze your way out of the fog. Sense-making is this wild idea that you often have to act your way into a new way of thinking. You basically create a plausible map of reality, and then you act as if that map is true.
So, you navigate this fog by engaging in a 3-step cycle. First up is enactment. You actively launch something, like a minimum viable product, just to generate a trace or see how the market reacts. Second is selection. You look at all that messy market data and choose a plausible interpretation. Maybe a failed launch isn't a defeat at all, but rather a signal that they want a totally different feature. And finally, retention. You pivot and formalize this new, successful interpretation into the company's core mission.
Sarasvati's brilliant chef metaphor contrasts this so beautifully. Traditional causation logic, that's basically like following a strict recipe. You pick a goal, you find the means to achieve it, and you focus heavily on prediction. But effectuation, that is entirely different. It's like a chef cooking an amazing meal using whatever random ingredients happen to already be in the fridge, even if it's just half an onion, 2 eggs, and some questionable hot sauce. Effectuation represents a logic of control rather than prediction. You start with your immediate means, who you are, what you know, and who you know, and you allow the goals to emerge organically.
And that leads us to our final section, Part 4, The Art of Making Do, Bricolage and Constraints. Let's explore how entrepreneurs process severe constraints without waiting around for traditional funding.
Unlike a traditional corporate engineer who might sit around waiting for perfect capital and a 50-page business plan, a bricolaire creates something from nothing. Bricolage is literally the art of making do. It's refusing to be paralyzed by a lack of traditional resources. You improvise with the junk at hand, treating scarcity not as a roadblock, but as the primary catalyst for innovation itself. It's a huge mindset shift.
Let's see how this builds into real-world survival strategies. As you can see, bricolage can mean reconfiguring physical technology, mobilizing labor networks, or manipulating institutional norms. Take MailChimp, for example. Look at how their founders survived their early days using institutional and labor bricolage. Instead of seeking big venture capital infusions, they bootstrapped the whole thing. They mobilized their informal networks and used their existing web design consulting business to fund their brand new email product. By continuously reinvesting the early cash flows from their services, they manipulated the norms to completely bypass equity dilution and millions in setup costs. They used the operational resources they already had to build a $12 billion empire, and they did it completely debt-free. Unbelievable, right?
So the blueprint here is crystal clear. From analytical planning, to learning by experimenting, to navigating ambiguity and making do with the resources right in front of you, building a business isn't magic. It is a process. And because it's a process, it can be learned, practiced, and executed by anyone who is willing to start. So, the only real question left for us to answer is, what will you build?